The Alabama Booksmith presents Author Spotlight. Because every book in our store is signed, our wall of fame displays a breathtaking array of writers and signatures. Close-up shots reveal giants of literature, acclaimed historians, stars of stage and screen, our nation's leaders, famous sports heroes, and thousands of other esteemed authors. Today's Wall of Fame guest is Victor Vescovo, who will discuss his new book, Expedition Deep Ocean, the first ascent to the bottom of all 5 of the world's oceans. And here is Victor Vescovo with our host, Jake Reese.
Welcome, Victor Vescovo, and welcome to our audience. We are honored to have you in Alabama. And before we start, let me assure everybody watching, this book is not science fiction. Although Expedition Deep Ocean is one of the most heart-stopping, page-turning books I've ever read. And while readers may be reminded of Jules Verne, we feel the Nautilus is like a bathtub toy compared to the limited factor. And 20,000 leagues is a tiny dot in the hundreds of square miles under the sea mapped by your guys. This book is about the only human to have been to the absolute bottom of all 5 oceans of the earth. And before we get to the lowest points, let's start with the highest. What is the Explorer's Grand Slam?
The Explorer's Grand Slam is a name given to a series of expeditions that results in someone climbing the highest mountain on all the 7 continents, as well as skiing at least 100 kilometers or 1 degree of latitude to the South Pole. If you do all of those things, you've achieved what is known as the Explorer's Grand Slam.
And you are a Grand Slammer.
Yes. Me and about 48 other people, I think.
About 48 others. Okay, well, that's a pretty small, exclusive club.
Yeah.
Now that you've been there, done that, when you had this urge to become the only member of the Who's Been to the Bottom of Every Ocean Club, did you Google rent a sub or email Uber underwater?
No, I wish I could have. It would have been a lot easier. And I think to the beginning of what you said, it's not a book of science fiction, but the idea started as science fiction, and then it ended up as a history, which is kind of fun to actually have lived through that, because I'm an enormous fan of science fiction as well as history. But the idea was, back in 2014 or so, I was curious about what would be a unique challenge, because I'd been mountain climbing for about almost 30 years of my life, and what would be a different type of challenge. And there was a nice symmetry from going from the mountains to the oceans. And just doing a little bit of research online or in libraries was that there had been only 2 visits to the bottom of the Challenger Deep, the deepest point in the ocean, in the Pacific Ocean. But no one had been to the bottom of the other 4 oceans. We weren't even sure where they were. No government had ever even attempted to do this, and only Richard Branson had spun out the idea that maybe he was going to try, but they chose a technology for the submarine that didn't quite work out. And so I thought, it's got to be technologically possible. How come no one has done it? And so the business in me and the Texan in me that we just go off and do things said, what would it take? And I did the math, and I talked to a couple of people in the very small submarine construction industry and found out that it would be difficult and expensive, but I had the ability to maybe make it happen. So I committed to it and set out on the path.
Wow. And came up with the scientific marvel that you did. It's just, that machine is totally fascinating. And okay, now you have this amazing equipment. How do you transport that sucker around to position it to dive to the bottom of the 5 oceans?
Well, that's kind of the real trick, is that there's always so much focus on the submersible, the limiting factor, which is indeed an extraordinarily technological feat that was designed and built by others. I funded it and just gave the requirements out there, but it was an extraordinary team that built that, and it gets 99% of the attention. But what I learned quickly is that, like in real life, it's not just about the bell of the ball. There is always a massive support infrastructure that has to enable that prima donna to achieve what it does, and that include a former U.S. Navy ship that I had to buy and completely refit. There was acquiring the most advanced sonar that a civilian currently operates, had to go onto the ship. There was the entire infrastructure of finance, accounting, legal, media. All of these things had to be put together almost like a startup company whose product was delivering me to the bottom of all 5 of the world's oceans safely and repeatedly. And so building all of that was an organizational, massive challenge on par with the technological one of building this up. But it all came together with fits and starts, as you'll read about in great detail in the book.
Wow. And this is just on your marks. Get set, get ready, go, or a long way ahead. The book describes the obstacles you faced before the limited factor attempted its first journey to the bottom of the first ocean. Would you describe just a few of those obstacles, please?
There were many, and they're in large silos of administrative ones, financial ones, and technical ones. The technical ones are some of the most interesting ones, and they were some of the most pernicious. But I think it bears reminding that, as I mentioned, only 2 submarines had ever visited the bottom of the ocean before, and they both only did it once. And both machines were damaged when they came back up. It's an incredibly hostile environment. So we were actually trying to develop the 3rd generation of technology that will allow a submersible to go down to the bottom of the ocean repeatedly and safely. And so that just required a whole level of technology that hadn't existed before and integrated. And so up until the first major dive in the Atlantic Ocean, which is 2/3 of full ocean depth, we still hadn't worked out the so-called kinks. But I would stress that what I consider the core functions of the submersible, life support, the buoyancy system to go up and down, fundamental control, the things that allow you to go down and come up safely, there was never a question of those not working properly. So most of the things you'll read about in the book about things not working were things that were not core, but kind of important. Almost as if you have a car and the engine and the tires and the steering wheel are rock solid. But a lot of the other things in the car don't work. The blinkers, the air conditioning system, the radio, and so that can be aggravating. And you kind of want the submarine to be in perfect condition when you dive to these extraordinary depths. But we worked those things out, sometimes just in the nick of time. And as we progressed, it became more and more reliable. But that's really what we were doing. Like any U.S. Navy vessel, we had a shakedown cruise. We just happened to do the shakedown cruise for this submarine by diving to the bottom of all 5 of the world's oceans.
Well, it's now showtime. You're ready for the curtain to go up. Take us through the opening of the hatch and, of course, closing it. The first trip down, the moment you landed, the time you spent on the bottom, and then the few miles back up.
And this is on the first dive in the Atlantic.
The first dive.
Well, there's a lot in there, because that was quite an emotional roller coaster, as you'll read about in the book, because we had allotted almost a week of time to dive in the Atlantic Ocean, and we thought, oh, things will work well. We'll have plenty of time to do maps, to do some scientific exploration. But instead, we were fighting pernicious little problems in the sub, to the point where when we had only 1 dive day left, for a variety of reasons, the submarine wasn't working properly. In fact, there was a horrible incident on one of the dives where we were at the very bottom of the ocean, and I was with the constructor of the submarine, Patrick Leahy, and we turned on a switch, and for a variety of reasons, the manipulator claw that we have on the submarine is only held by a single bolt, so that it can be ejected if it ever got entangled with something. Well, that bolt bracket wasn't designed exactly right, And when we activated it on one of our test dives, the arm fell off. A very expensive piece of equipment in 6 figures that just was now sitting on the bottom of the seafloor. So when I joked that the submarine cost me an arm and a leg, it quite literally cost me an arm. But that was a problem because it's just like, how can we not have that work? But in a very strange irony, when we lost the manipulator arm, all of the electronic circuits that were needed to operate the arm now became available to make the other parts of the submarine work that were having issues. So in a way, we almost kind of hotwired the sub to make this dive on this one last chance. And I was very frustrated, and some people thought I might actually cancel the expedition until we could completely rebuild the sub. But the team from Triton Submarines insisted that they could make it work. And so I left them alone for about a day and a half. And I basically holed myself up in my own cabin so I wouldn't interfere with their work. And then they came to me a couple of hours before launch and they're saying, no, we think we nailed it. We think we nailed everything. And I was like, really? You sure about that? But I told them, I said, look, if you really believe it, then I'm willing to make the dive. And I said, if anything goes wrong on the way down, I'm immediately dropping weights and I'm coming back up. They said, okay. But to your earlier point, getting in that hatch, closing that hatch is quite a major psychological kind of impact when that hatch closes. And I tell the diver, I say, I'll see you on the other side. Like, I don't know what's going to happen next, really. And yet that dive was incredibly peaceful and went off without a hitch. And the depthometer kept going down and down past 4,000 meters and then 5,000 meters, past the point where the current deepest diving submersible has gone. And now we've beaten that on this, my first solo dive in the submarine, which only compounded the intensity of the emotion. And then, sure enough, about 30 feet off the bottom, the lights start reflecting off the bottom into this soft beige color. And I was just thinking, oh my gosh, it's actually working and I'm still here. And then getting to the bottom. And then something funny happened at this deep compared to any of the other 5. The bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in the Puerto Rican Trench is incredibly soft and spongy, more than any other ocean. It's just the way it is. So when the submarine actually landed on the bottom, I was so relieved. I was like, oh my gosh, we actually made it. But the sub kept sinking into this muck to the point where the lights actually got covered by the silt and it went all dark again. And then I immediately kind of realized what was happening. Okay, I'm going back up a little bit, turned the thrusters on, and then I started hovering off the bottom. And then I felt like any 10-year-old kid with their new bicycle in a new town. It's like, I have no agenda. I'm in a submarine on the bottom of the Atlantic. Let's go look around. So I just drove around, and after an hour or so, I got a very quiet call from the surface saying, what are your intentions? Which is their code for, are you coming up now? And I think they were a little worried. They wanted to check everything out. So I said, no, I'm good. And I dropped the weights and went back up. And the sense of elation, not just for myself, but the entire crew, when I cracked that hatch and we were on the surface and we had dived to 8,000 plus meters, the first dive to the bottom of the Atlantic, the true bottom of the Atlantic, everyone was just overjoyed. Then we knew we had a vessel that almost certainly could make it to the 5 deeps. It was just a question of making it happen.
Boy, you made it happen. I'm going to read something. In your book, John F. Kennedy said in March of 1961, and I don't remember it, so I'm going to read it off here. And I'll quote John F. Kennedy. Knowledge of the oceans is more than a matter of curiosity. Our very survival may hinge upon it. And it's obvious to me you agree with JFK. You have risked your life and invested quite a fortune. Would you describe a little bit of the mapping operation, which fascinated me, and just a few of the scientific finds, please?
Sure. The mapping came about because we had to do it. If you're going to dive to the bottom of the 5 oceans, you have to know where to dive. And I was naive in the beginning, thinking that, of course, we knew where the bottom of the 5 oceans were. I mean, you can go on Google and you can see a map of the ocean floor. And yet, in one of our first meetings with our scientific team, they were indicating that, Victor, you know that we really don't know where the bottom of all 5 oceans are, except maybe the one in the Pacific, the Challenger, which has been dived twice. And I was like, you've got to be kidding me. They said, no, you're actually going to have to map the bottom of these very deep trenches to precisely target where the deepest point is. I went, you're kidding. Well, what do I need to do that? Oh, well, you need a massive sonar to put on your ship. And one thing led to another, and yeah, I had to invest in a multi-million-dollar Kongsberg EM124 sonar, the most advanced ever developed for a civilian vessel, serial number 1, and we had to put the ship into dry dock and install the sonar and then calibrate it and make it work, which is not a simple undertaking. But once that was done, we had a tool that could map the very deepest parts of our oceans. And it's one thing to be able to map something that's 1,000 or 2,000 meters deep, or even the average depth of the ocean of 5,000 meters. But to get all the way down to 11,000 meters, you need a very powerful instrument and someone who knows how to operate it. And so then we had to build a sonar team, which we did with the University of New Hampshire and some wonderful sonar operators, including Cassie Bongiovanni, who's one of the best in the world. And then we set out to map these deep trenches and pinpoint with the sonar where we are sure the deepest point is, and then verify it by sending down robotic landers and then sending down the submarine. So a very involved process. I just didn't want to be in the position where 5 years from now someone would come to me and say, you know what, Victor, you actually dove in the wrong place. In fact, there were 2 oceans where it wasn't completely clear if we had identified the deepest point. For example, in the Indian Ocean, even Richard Branson identified the deepest point as the Diamantina fracture zone, not the Java Trench. They were really, really close. So we mapped and dove both of them, and it turned out they were only separated by about 120 meters. Same thing happened in the Pacific. Everyone assumes the deepest point in the Pacific is the Challenger Deep. Mm-hmm. Well, the Tonga Trench is incredibly active and almost as deep. And some people were saying there's a chance it could be deeper than the Challenger Deep, which I was kind of hoping it was. But we went there, we mapped the heck out of it, and then I personally dove it, and it was 110 meters shallower, out of 11,000 meters. So it was really close. But what was interesting is that we were going all over the world, so basically we kept the sonar on and deliberately mapped areas that had never been mapped before. So at this point in 2020, we've mapped over 1 million square kilometers of seafloor, including the most difficult parts for people to map, which were the deep trenches, which they kind of had given up on because no one had ever had the technology or the funds or inclination to do it, but that's what we do. So I'm very happy that almost a secondary mission of our expedition was to map, and it was incredibly successful. And we're continuing to do that today.
I would say 1 million square miles was
kilometers.
Kilometers. Oh, kilometers.
We're working our way to 1 million square kilometers. We're getting there.
And what about sharing just a little bit of your scientific find?
Sure, the scientific finds, that was a whole different angle apart from the mapping and the technology of the limiting factor in the diving. So quickly we had a science team built out and embarked on the vessel, mainly at the urging of my expedition leader, who said, Victor, yeah, diving to the bottom is going to be great, but you have this opportunity to do a lot of science in places no one's ever visited before. So with Dr. Alan Jameson, who's probably the world's leading expert on the very deep ocean, the Hadal Zone, he came on board and we had a rotating crew of scientists come on board. We believe we discovered over 40 new species across our expedition so far, because every place it seemed that we dove, no one had ever done a manned dive there. And these were isolated areas of the ocean in the deepest areas, so evolutionarily they could be quite different or similar. And so we found out all this information. There was other things that we found out. Whenever we went down, we sent down my 3 robotic landers, and they captured all the data, the salinity, the temperature, and other factors of the water column. And so it was subtle, but what we discovered at the end of the 5 Deeps expedition is that we had basically captured several million kilometers of water data up and down in greatly different areas of the globe, all within the same year, with the same instruments, with the same scientists reading the data. So any scientist out there will acknowledge that that's a hell of a baseline that you can then use in the future to compare against, that helps you with climate models, ocean current analysis, all these very esoteric things. But in a way, I was very proud that I hadn't really thought of that, but it's like, wow, what a great contribution to have this baseline created.
One of my many OMG moments in reading the book were the details about your crew. Just a quick synopsis.
The proper band of pirates, as they've been called.
Tell our audience about the little crew you assembled.
The little crew I assembled was interesting. It was kind of like the movie The Dirty Dozen sometimes. But no, that's a disservice to them. I always go with the intention of trying to work with the best people that I know, or recommendations from people that I trust. And sometimes that yields very strong personalities. People that are very good at what they do tend to have very strong opinions and strong personalities. But then managing them is kind of an art. But that's actually what I do in my civilian career, is I help manage large companies. And a lot of that is about talent management and getting people towards the same goal. And so I was fortunate. I was able to identify quickly some very, very capable individuals. Some people did not work out, and that's my job to make sure that those replacements happen before they cause too much damage. And so by the end, we just had an incredibly strong team that then had worked together through adversity. And like any large organization that people have been part of, you had a very cohesive, incredibly high-performing team. And we did the whole expedition without any serious injuries. We achieved the objective. We did it pretty much on time. It was a great experience. So it was all about the people, because the people are the key. If I hadn't had the people, I couldn't have done it alone, not even remotely. And anyone that hadn't been near the top of their game, we would have fallen down on one of the major elements: the submarine, the mapping, the science, the administration, all of that.
For the record, how many in your crew?
Well, it's a tough answer, because the most we could hold on the ship at one time was 49. And so we did have 49 people on the ship at one time. But if I add up all the people that touched the project at one point or another in a significant way, it was easily over 100 to 150.
Which will segue greatly into the next part. In September of last year, you sailed up the Thames into London, having gone where no man has gone before, and you picked up several folks whom you wanted to honor for their help in this venture. One of them was Richard DeShazo, the CFO of the corporate entity that designed, built, and operated this remarkable adventure. In the book, you describe him as a 66-year-old Southern gentleman with an accent to match his upbringing. And he's the guy who dished out $1 million here, $1 million there before it really amounted to anything to make everything happen. And since he is our Alabama connection and responsible for us knowing about this amazing adventure and getting you here, I'd like to take a moment from the interview, since he's sitting here, he's our audience of one, and wave, Dick DeShazo, thank you, thank you.
Hey guys, thank you.
The man with the money. But in my fairness, I did not write that.
Okay.
Josh Young, the author, did.
Okay.
I won't disagree with that description. I would have used far more ebullient terms, but that'll suffice.
I was going to disagree. It didn't sound like he has an accent to me. Thanks, Dick. Thanks for making this happen. A Dallas magazine called you the most interesting man in that proud Texas city, and we'd like to widen that claim to include this whole planet. We've been shouting out to all who will listen that this book is an amazing read, and so it's only right that we now give a shout out to the author, the talented Josh Young, amazing writer, and a string of New York Times bestsellers. And while you are the one who lived this, unbelievable adventure, it wouldn't be on our shelves without Josh's craftsmanship. Victor, I'm going to ask you to please close by reading the inspirational message you delivered at the Royal Geographical Society in London, where they celebrated your accomplishments in rather than reading it from the book, would you read that, please?
Sure. Yeah, I definitely did say this. It sounds like me. So, unless the laws of physics forbid it, very little is truly impossible. It might be harder, it might take longer, it might be more expensive, but if people put their minds to it, they can do extraordinary things. If there is one thing I've seen about individuals, it's that they constantly sell themselves short. They never really achieve their full potential because they never really admit how much they can achieve. You just have to wake up in the morning and say you expect more of yourself, and then you can break your own barriers on your way to breaking other ones. And I firmly believe that.
Well, that is a message we can all take, those of us who have no intention of going up the highest mountains or down to the deepest oceans. There's so much in this book we were unable to cover because of time restraints, but Victor, thank you for your service in the United States Navy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Go Navy, beat Army.
Oh. That'll cost us half our audience.
Oh, sorry, I love it. One of my best friends is in the Army. Gotta do it.
And thank you for your never-ending gift to humankind. For years and decades and centuries to come, what you have done is a gift to us all. Thank you for coming to Alabama. And thank you for signing our book.
Of course. Thank you, Jake, very much.
You may purchase signed first editions of Expedition Deep Ocean at alabamabooksmith.com.